Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be talking about some of my favourite authors of historical fiction. So about like 5 or 6 years ago, I did a video on this channel called My Favourite Historical Fiction, and it occurred to me that it might be good to do an updated version. And someone actually asked me recently, like in the comments of that old video, if I had a more up-to-date one, and it has been vaguely on my radar in my head to do a new one for a while. So I sat down to start thinking about what my favourite historical fiction is, but I realised that I read so much historical fiction now, and I've read so much historical fiction over the last 5 years, that coming up with like a top 20, top 30 list of books would be quite difficult. And also there are lots of authors that I've read multiple amazing books from that I would kind of like end up filling the list up with. So I thought what I would do instead is kind of do this in two halves. So today I'm going to be talking about some of my like go-to historical fiction authors who I absolutely love, whose work I really enjoy, who I've read multiple books from and kind of want to read everything by if I haven't already. And then I think on Monday probably, or sometime next week, I will have another video which will be a sort of top 20 maybe historical novels, which will include some books by the authors I'm talking about today, but not like all of their books, and will also include lots of books by other authors. I'm saying a top 20 tentatively because at the present moment in time there are 35 books on the list for that video. That's definitely too many novels for me to talk about in one video, so I'm going to try and tighten it down to 20, but it's probably actually going to be 25, knowing me. But anyway, regardless, today I have some amazing historical fiction authors to talk to you about. So I'm not going to rank the authors today really, but I have sort of separated them into sections. So first I have like my 4 absolute favourite historical fiction writers, and then I have some other authors who I really love too, and who I'm sure will be like top tier favourites the more I read by them. But we're going to start off with the top 4 who I've read everything by. My favourite historical fiction author, my favourite author who is, you know, not from the 19th century, is Natasha Pulley, who is a wonderful writer. I have read all her books so far. She's got a new one out next month, I think, maybe the month after. So yes, I have read her 5 works of historical fiction, and then she also published a work of science fiction last year, The Mars House. But her works of historical fiction are The Watchmaker of Filigree Street, which is set in 19th century Britain, and its sequel, The Lost Future of Pepper Harrow, which is set in 19th century Britain and Japan. A couple of little bits of The Watchmaker of Filigree Street are set in Japan as well, but in general this is set in Britain, and in general this is set in Japan. And they are 2 wonderful novels following a man called Nathaniel who ends up befriending a watchmaker, and slightly potentially magical things ensue, and it's just like, it's so good. The Watchmaker of Filigree Street is just one of my absolute favourite novels of all time. And I love it so much, and I'm so emotionally attached to the characters and everything about this book, and I just had like a wonderful reading experience of it, and I just, yeah. It was the first book by Natasha Pulley I read. It was her first novel, and I love her writing so much that like The Watchmaker of Filigree Street, as the first book I read by her, will always like stay in my heart. I think it's incredible. Then she has some other works of historical fiction. So we have The Bedlam Stacks, which is set in 19th century Peru. And then we have The Kingdoms. So The Kingdoms is set in like 18th and 19th century Britain, but it is a like alternative sort of world. There's some complicated timey-wimey stuff going on. It's just so good, and it's so wacky and weird, but I love it so much, and I just think it's incredible. Yeah, I don't want to talk too much about all the individual novels anyway. And then there's also The Half-Life of Valerie Kay, which is set in 1960s, 1960s Russia. And yeah, basically Natasha Pulley is one of my absolute favourite authors. I love the way she writes. There's something about her books that just like, for me, is just exactly what I want. Like, her writing style is just precision engineered to be for me, and her use of speculative elements is really, really interesting, but I also think she uses that to explore a period in time really interestingly. And I also think she's really good at creating very, very complicated, nuanced characters who are often quite unlikable and make complicated decisions, but you also understand them. And I just think she's incredible. So Natasha Pulley is my favourite historical fiction author. She has slightly moved away from historical fiction lately. Like I said, her most recent book was science fiction, fantastic too. Do recommend The Mars House. And her new book coming out is a Greek myth retelling, and I don't know how historical versus magical it is, but I'm looking forward to it anyway, and I will always read anything Natasha Pulley writes because I do think her books are fantastic. If you want to know where to start with Natasha Pulley, I would recommend either The Watchmaker of Furgary Street or The Kingdoms. Both books I think will be great places to start, and yeah, I love them both a lot. And then my next go-to favourite historical fiction author is the wonderful Sarah Waters. So I've read all 6 of her books, all of which are historical, all of which are fantastic. So she has 3 that are set in the Victorian period. That is Fingersmith, Tipping the Velvet and Affinity. And then she has 3 which are set in the early 20th century. So The Paying Guest is set in the 1920s. The Little Stranger is set in the 1940s, sort of late 1940s after the Second World War. And The Night Watch is set in the 1940s, but early 1940s. So it's set kind of during and after the Second World War, and it kind of works backwards in a very interesting way. I love Sarah Waters a lot. I think she's a fantastic, fantastic writer. I think she's really just very, very skilled. She writes incredibly pacey books. Some are pacier than others. I would say she's quite good at a slow burn first half with a very dramatic second half. The Paying Guest, for example, has quite a slow sort of first half, but it really worked for me. But I wouldn't necessarily say it's the place to start with her. Sarah Waters is really amazing at writing great twists and really wonderful plots. And I also think she, like Natasha Pulley, is very good at writing complicated characters. She looks really interestingly at queer history as well, as does Natasha Pulley actually. And I just think Sarah Waters is such a fantastic, fantastic writer. But yeah, I don't even know how to pick a favourite Sarah Waters book. I think maybe it's Affinity, which is a fantastic book set in the 19th century, partly set in a prison. But I don't actually know if it is Affinity. It might also be Tipping the Velvet, which is probably where I'd recommend starting with Sarah Waters. This is a great coming-of-age story set in the Victorian period, really, really good fun. So I started with Fingersmith, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend starting with Fingersmith. In fact, I quite like to reread Fingersmith, because I feel like when I first read it, I was like, are there too many twists? And now I don't think there were. But I was slightly overwhelmed by the twisty-turny nature of this book when I first read it. And I feel like, having now read lots of Sarah Waters, I would have an even greater appreciation for Fingersmith than I did when I first read it. That's a long way of me saying I think Tipping the Velvet is probably the best place to start with her work, for me personally. But maybe if you love a sort of thrillery, twisty-turny book, then maybe do try Fingersmith first, but be prepared for many twists. Oh, but she's so great though. I love Sarah Waters' books so much. I just think she's such a skilled, wonderful, wonderful writer, and I highly recommend all her books. Another absolute favourite writer of mine is Diane Setterfield, who is truly, truly incredible. The 13th Tale remains my favourite novel of all time that is not from the 19th century. She has published 3 novels, all of which are historical. The 13th Tale is probably the least historical, but it is still quite historical. The 13th Tale is a story within a story in the present day-ish, but time is very obscure in this book. We encounter a woman who is summoned to write a biography of a very famous novelist, and then the novelist tells her the story of her life. When the 13th Tale is set is quite debatable and quite hard to judge. I think it's probably set over the course of the 20th century, but time is quite ethereal in this book. It's got quite a fairy tale feel to it. So I think it is historical fiction, but I feel like it sits less comfortably in historical fiction than some of the other books I'm talking about today. But yeah, it's wonderful. It's the best. It's a story about storytelling and books and writing and families, and it's gothic and has lots of Bronte references, and it's just the best book ever, except for some Victorian books, but It's really, really great. And then I also love her books, Bellman and Black and Once Upon a River. Bellman and Black is set in the Victorian period and is about a man who makes a dangerous pact and the funeral industry. Really, really great book. And Once Upon a River is all about kind of storytelling and various characters who are all kind of connected by the River Thames and an inn on the River Thames, and the appearance of a young, mysterious girl whose identity is unknown. And this is also set in the Victorian period, and it's just like, it's so good. It's so good. Diane Setterfield is incredible. I think in terms of where to start with her books, I would basically say don't start with Bellman and Black, because I feel like that tends to be people's least favourite, and I think it's the hardest to get into. I would say start with Once Upon a River or The 13th Tale. If you're looking for more like direct historical fiction, then I guess Once Upon a River is the way to go. But if you love a story within a story, and if you want something like superbly gothic, then The 13th Tale is probably the way to go. But yeah, she's just one of my absolute favourite authors. I hope she writes more books. Her books have come out quite sort of sporadically, and I hope there are more one day. But yeah, I love her books a lot. And then my fourth favourite writer of historical fiction is a writer who I don't think everyone would necessarily think of as primarily a writer of historical fiction, and that is Kazuo Ishiguro. So Ishiguro is obviously a very, very famous, well-known writer, but I feel like people don't predominantly think of him as a writer of historical fiction, partly because I think his sort of most famous books and his more recent books have been in different genres. So, you know, thinking about the sort of science fiction works he's written, like Never Let Me Go and Clara and the Sun, both of which are incredible. But he has written 4 books that I would class as historical. Whether everyone would class them as historical is probably debatable. Some of them are set like 30, 40 years before they were published, which, for example, wouldn't be eligible for the World Scott Prize for historical fiction, but I would consider historical fiction if it's like very about a particular point in time. So 4 books here that I would class as historical fiction. So we have The Remains of the Day, which is my favourite book by Ishiguro. Is it? Do I love Never Let Me Go more? It doesn't matter. That's not historical. The Remains of the Day is one of my favourite books of all time. It is incredible. So this was published in the late 1980s, I believe, and it's set in the 1950s and the 1930s. So historical, but not hugely historical, but like it's so much about the 1950s as a point in time, and also about the 1930s and kind of the interwar period, that it definitely counts as historical for me. It's also just the best. So The Remains of the Day is this incredible novel about a butler called Stevens, who in the 1950s has a new employer who doesn't really care about the old ways and how things used to be done. The Stevens feels like he is becoming a bit more obsolete, and then he ends up going on this sort of drive around England, reflecting on his past, especially his experiences between the First and Second World Wars, and his relationship with another woman on the staff of the house he worked at. And I just think it's one of the most beautiful, exquisitely crafted books ever written, and I love it a lot. And this is probably where I'd recommend starting with Ishiguro as well, and I just think it is the best. Then there's also When We Were Orphans, which came out in 2000, I think, and is set in the 1930s, so even the World Scott Prize would accept this as historical. And this book follows a detective in the 1930s in London and Shanghai who is kind of haunted by the disappearances of his parents when he was a child, and I just think this book is incredibly written. And then Ishiguro also wrote 2 novels that came out in the 1980s and are set in the late 1940s in post-war Japan. So we have A Pale View of the Hills and An Artist of the Floating World. Both of these books are incredible and look really, really interestingly at the kind of legacy and aftermath of the Second World War in Japan, and I just think they are incredible books that I would really, really recommend. I don't know whether Ishiguro will write any more historical fiction. He seems to have moved away from that a little bit now, and he obviously moves around in genre quite a lot, which I love. I love all his books, but these 4 books are incredible, and I would really recommend them all. Like I said, I think The Remains of the Day is probably the place to start. and I feel like A Pale View of Hills is probably the least accessible, though I do think it's great. And yeah, I just think his books are amazing. So those are my like 4 favorite historical fiction authors, and I have read everything I can by those authors at this stage. But there are lots of other authors of historical fiction who I love, who I have read some things by and have more to read by, who I wanted to talk about today. So one of them is Emma Donoghue. I think Emma Donoghue is a fantastic writer. I have read 5 novels by her, these 4 historical fiction novels, and her novel Room, which is not historical but is one of her most famous. So the 4 works of historical fiction I've read by her, I have Learn by Heart, which is set in early 19th century England and looks at the relationship between 2 teenage girls at boarding school. I also have read Frog Music, which is set in 1870s San Francisco, and is a really dramatic, pacey novel. There's also The Pull of the Stars, which is set in Dublin in 1918 in a maternity ward during the flu epidemic. And this book is amazing and incredible, but also like to be read with a strong stomach, and possibly like not if you're thinking about having a baby anytime soon, because the details of childbirth in this book were extreme, but it's fantastic. And then finally there is The Wonder by Emma Donoghue, which is one of my absolute favourite books ever. One of my absolute favourite works of historical fiction ever. It is incredible and amazing. And this book is also quite like medically intense, but really, really good. And this basically follows a woman who is a nurse, and she comes to Ireland in order to watch over a young girl who it is claimed is miraculously staying alive without eating. But is she? Our main character is there to find out. And it's so good. It's so intense and it's so good, and it's incredible, and I love it a lot. I think I did an individual book review of this when I first read it, same with The Watchmaker of Filigree Street, so I'll leave those links down below. I would say in terms of where to start with Emma Donoghue, I started with The Wonder. Well, that's not true, I read Room first, but in terms of her historical fiction, I think The Wonder is a great place to start with her books. I think it is really fantastic, really intense, just incredible. I think this probably is the best place to start of the ones I've read, but I definitely do want to read more by her. So she's written quite a lot of books. I think she's written nearly 20, and a lot of them are historical. They're not all historical. As I said, Rome is not historical, but quite a lot of her books are historical. There's a lot of them that I do want to read. I think probably next on my list are Slamakin and The Sealed Letter. Probably The Sealed Letter is top of my list because I know it's based on a real historical figure who I'm quite interested in. This woman was cited in a divorce case in the Victorian period for having had a relationship with the wife who this man was divorcing, and I feel like I would be really interested to read a novel about her. So I definitely want to read The Sealed Letter at some point, and you know, all of Emma Donoghue's books. I feel like I'm not in a hurry. I really like her books, but she's written a lot, but I do know that I want to keep reading her works, and she is definitely one of my favourite authors of historical fiction. Another very prolific writer of historical fiction who has a lot of books, and I've only read some, is Robert Harris. So I have read 5 of his novels, one of which, Conclave, was not historical, but the other 4 were. So Act of Oblivion is a fantastic novel set in 17th century England and America, looking at the aftermath of the Restoration, what happens after the restoration of the monarchy to the people who voted on the execution of Charles I. It's an incredible chase narrative. It's so good. I shouldn't go on about it for too long because I've got lots of authors and books to talk about in this video. And then the other 3 books I've read by Robert Harris are his Cicero trilogy, set in ancient Rome, looking at the life of the historical figure Cicero. Robert Harris is an incredible writer. I think a lot about the Cicero trilogy and Act of Oblivion, and I thought Conclave was great too. I read that recently, but that's not historical, so we're not worrying about that today. But I just think his writing is incredible, and his complicated characterization and his efforts to make you understand people whose viewpoints and worlds seem alien. Like, it's so clever and masterfully done. I feel like Robert Harris's examination of humanity at different points in history is just amazing. So I have many more books by Robert Harris to read. I think he's written 15 novels, many of which are historical, a few of which aren't. I haven't read any of his like 20th century historical fiction. I think he's written quite a lot about the Second World War, which I would like to read. I'd like to read his book about Pompeii. There's definitely a lot more Robert Harris for me to explore. Do let me know where you think I should be going next. I just think he's a wonderful, wonderful writer. And I love the Cicero series. And in some ways, I think it's a good place to start with Robert Harris. That's where I started with him, but obviously it is a trilogy, and certainly the last book at least is quite long, so that may put you off. And I do think Act of Oblivion is a great place to start with his work too. It is just incredible. It's so good. Okay, from Robert Harris, let's move on to another wonderful writer of historical fiction, Jill Hornby, who is, fun fact, married to Robert Harris. Isn't that fun? She's also the sister of Nick Hornby. Can you imagine, like, Christmas in that family if you were the one person who wasn't a famous writer? Anyway, Jill Hornby is a wonderful writer. I have read 2 novels by her, Miss Austen and Gomersham Park, both of which are set in the first half of the 19th century, both of which kind of riff on real life figures from the life of Jane Austen. So Miss Austen is about Jane Austen's sister Cassandra, Gomersham Park is about the governess of Jane Austen's niece. And Jill Hornby has a new novel coming out later this year called The Elopement, which I think also deals with people on the periphery of Jane Austen's life, which I just kind of love as a thing. I think she also published 2 novels before Miss Austen, neither of which are historical, but I am interested in reading them at some point. I love a lot about Jill Hornby's books. I think one of the things I really love about Miss Austen especially, but Gomersham Park too, is her ability to look at, like, the lives of women in the footnotes, not just because they were figures within Jane Austen's life, but because they were women who were not considered special or extraordinary or outstanding, but were still really interesting. You know, I feel like often when people talk about women's history, they are looking at, like, the exceptional women whose lives were very, very different. But actually, like, I'm also really fascinated in the lives of women who were not particularly extraordinary. And I just think Jill Hornby is really wonderful at writing about that part of women's history, and the lives of people like that. And I just love her books a lot. Miss Austen is one of, like, the best books about grief I've ever read. And I also just, like, adored it in every way. And Gomersham Park is fantastic too. And I love how these books are historical fiction about people within Jane Austen's life, but also have, like, an inkling of a Jane Austen retelling in them. Like, I just don't think I've ever seen anything more fun than the Crawford siblings from Mansfield Park reinterpreted as Jane Austen and her brother Henry. Just, like, excellent. I love her books a lot. I am very excited for The Elopement later this year. Another wonderful author I wanted to mention is Andrea Levy. I've read 2 of her novels, both of which are incredible works of historical fiction. She passed away a few years ago, and I think she wrote 5 novels over the course of her life. I don't know if the other 3 are historical. I get the impression from looking at them, I think one is set, like, 30 years before it was published, but I don't know whether it, like, goes up to the present day or is just set 30 years before it was published. One of them I think is set kind of around the time it was published, and then one I think is, like, multi-generational, possibly set a while before it was published and in the present day when it was published. I'm not sure. So I think they may have historical elements, but I don't think they're as historical. But I do definitely want to read them because I have loved the 2 books I've read by her so much. So The Long Song is an incredible novel set in 19th century Jamaica, over kind of a few different time periods. You can see I really like this on the spine. It says 1800, 1831 and 1850, and it looks at the life of one woman growing up in slavery in Jamaica, her experiences, and her efforts to try and make a life for herself in the midst of a turbulent, terrible time in history. And it's just amazing. And then Small Island is fantastic. This book is set before, during and after the Second World War, and looks at the experiences of 4 different people, 2 British, 2 Jamaican, what happens when the 2 characters from Jamaica come to England, and how all their lives intersect. And it's just amazing. It's so good. I must reread Small Island because I haven't read it for, I guess, just over 10 years. I studied this at university, so I did read it twice, but that was a decade ago. And I have also seen the stage adaptation and the TV adaptation, both of which are great, but therefore, like, I don't feel like the novel is as fresh in my mind as I would like it to be. So I really, really do recommend Andrea Levy. I think she's an incredible writer. I think you could start with her work with either of these. I think I probably love Small Island more, but that might just be because I studied it at university. But yeah, she's great. Another wonderful author who I've read 2 books from is Essia Dujan. I think she's a fantastic writer of historical fiction. I think she's written 3 novels, so I must go back and read The Second Life of Samuel Tyne, which I think was her first book. But here we have Washington Black and Half-Blood Blues, both of which are incredible. I probably love Half-Blood Blues more, but I feel like that is mostly because it's a book about music, and I love books about music. I feel like I would recommend both of these very much. And actually, Washington Black is incredible too. Okay, this book is about Washington Black, who begins his life on a slave plantation in Barbados, but ends up traveling the world. And this book is so fantastic, thematically incredible, really well written, and it has this like real Dickensian quality to it. It's a Bildungsroman. It's quite like eccentric, and it's just so good. It's so good. And then Hartwood Blues is about various black jazz musicians living in Berlin when the Second World War starts, and it's about their experiences in the 1930s and 40s, and also them looking back on it later in life. And it's so good. It's so good. So yeah, Essie Adujian, highly recommend her books. These two books are fantastic. I definitely need to read the third one by her. And then the other author I wanted to mention is another author who writes like quite recent historical fiction. So whether or not you count her books as historical is probably debatable. But that is Taylor Jenkins Reid, because I think I would consider her one of my favourite authors of historical fiction, even if her books aren't as historical as some of the historical fiction I read. So I've read 3 books by her. We have The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, which is set from the 1950s to the present day, and it's a story within a story. Kind of similar setup to The 30th Tale, but with an actress talking about her lives and her 7 husbands. I love it so much. Then I also absolutely adore Daisy Jones and the Six, which is set in the 1970s and is about a group of musicians and their complicated relationships, and it is told in the form of transcripts. Then I also love Malibu Rising, which is set in the 1980s and looks at very complicated relationships within a family over the course of one day as they throw this big party. I love Taylor Jenkins Reid a lot. I think she is a really wonderful writer of incredible characters, and I also think she's really fantastic at kind of capturing a moment in time. Like, one of the reasons why I really consider her an author of historical fiction, even though like some of her books are set in the 1980s, which is not that long ago, is because like Malibu Rising has to be in 1983. Like, it's so much about the 1980s in many ways, and the fact that it's historical and the fact that it's set 40 years ago is like very important to it. So it feels like it is historical fiction to me. I definitely want to read more by Taylor Jenkins Reid. She's written lots of books, some of which are contemporary, some of which are modern historical again. So I think Carrie Soto is Back is set in the 1990s. I think Atmosphere is set in the 1980s. I think the other ones are relatively contemporary, but I need to check up on that. But yes, I need to read everything by her because I really love her books. And in fact, I should soon, because I haven't read any books by her since I read Malibu Rising, which was a couple of years ago now. And I loved it a lot. So yes, I need to read more by Taylor Jenkins Reid. She is incredible. So there we go. Those are my 10 like top historical fiction authors, I would say. Some of the authors I've been speaking about, some of the novels I've been speaking about will be in my top 20/25 historical novels that I talk about whenever that is next week. But I wanted to talk about these authors like as a whole, and about their incredible work overall as well. Finally, before I wrap up this video, there are 4 other authors who I wanted to mention. If you don't know, I work as an editor. I used to work in-house. I'm now freelance. But over the course of my editorial career, it has been my privilege to work on some amazing authors of historical fiction. And there are a few authors who I've read lots of books by, some of which I've worked on, some of which I haven't, or maybe I've worked on them all, but you know, it varies between the authors. But I kind of wanted to talk about these authors because it's a bit complicated to say that an author you've worked on is your favourite author. Like, you just have a very different relationship to books that you've edited rather than just books that you've read. And I often feel like really emotionally invested in the careers of authors I've worked on. Like, I just think very differently about books I've worked on to books I've read. But I do think these 4 authors are incredible, and I think that most of people who kind of watch my channel would probably like them. So I thought I would also talk about them in this video as kind of like favourite historical fiction writers, even though it's a slightly different thing when you've worked on authors' books. Anyway, that was a long enough ramble. Basically, 4 authors whose books I've worked on, who I wanted to tell you about briefly. One is Stacey Halls, who is a fantastic writer of historical fiction. The Familiars is set in the 17th century and explores the Pendle witch trials. The Foundling is set in the 18th century and looks at the Foundling Hospital in London. Mrs. England is set in the very early 20th century, looking at a family with a lot of secrets. And The Household is set in the Victorian period and looks at the home for homeless women that Charles Dickens set up. All 4 of these books are incredible. I would really recommend them all. I think all 4 of them are pretty good places to start with Stacey Halls's books. I just think she's great. So I wanted to mention her books today. Then another author I wanted to mention is Liz Hyder. She has 2 historical novels for adults, The Gifts and The Illusions, both of which are set in the 19th century, both of which have speculative elements. Liz Hyder's characterization is just like absolutely superb, and I find her books such a utter delight. She also writes books for children, but they aren't historical, so I won't talk about them here really. I haven't read Bearmouth, have read The 12. The 12 is great. Anyway, not historical. I don't think Bearmouth is historical. I haven't read it. I may be wrong. But anyway, she's a great writer. Really recommend her books. I also wanted to mention Lex Croucher. They've written 3 like absolutely hilarious, delightful novels set in the Regency period: Reputation, Infamous and Trouble. They also write historical YA. I haven't worked on any of their YA, but it is amazing. Gwen and Art Are Not in Love is a wonderful, queer, medieval, joyous thing that I really recommend. And I need to read their newest historical YA book, Not for the Faint of Heart, as well. Then I also wanted to mention CJ Cook. She writes lots of different things. Some of her work has historical elements, some doesn't. And quite a few of her historical books are like half historical, half present day, or have like a mix of mundane historical elements. But I do think they're all really great, and I think probably quite a lot of you would enjoy them. So the 4 books by her that have some kind of historical elements are The Lighthouse Witches, The Ghost Woods, A Haunting in the Arctic, and The Book of Witching, all of which are great, all of which have some speculative elements. Sometimes CJ Cook like almost borders on horror. She writes like feminist gothic stuff so well, and yeah, I think you would probably really like her books too. So yeah, I just thought I would mention those 4 authors because they're authors who I have read and or worked on a lot of their books. I think they're really, really fantastic writers of historical fiction that I kind of wanted to include, but as I said, it's a bit like different when you've worked on an author. You have a very different like relationship to those books, but I did want to talk about them in this video briefly anyway, and yeah, I would really recommend all of those books. So those are some historical fiction authors who I really, really love. I'll be back at some point relatively soon with a top 20 to 30 historical novels, where I will talk about some of the books I've spoken about today and also a lot of other books. Do let me know down in the comments who are some of your favourite historical fiction authors. Do you have any recommendations for me of where to go next with some of the authors who I love but I've got more to read from? And yeah, that's all for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video. Oh, there's too many books. The problem with talking about your favourite authors is that you have a lot of their books in hardback and they're really heavy. Okay.